how on God's green earth can anyone really celebrate or commiserate their Premier League standing on the final day if we have to wait 5 further days for the final decision to be made and the final table to take place? It's a madness. It is the equivalent of VAR and how it's ruining goal celebrations, the ability for any team to ever celebrate a goal in 100% emotional outcry, because you don't know if it's going to stand for 5 minutes until the guys in the studio who have access to the cameras have finished drawing lines on a piece of paper. It is silly. Yes, guys, how you doing? Welcome back to Sean Butler TV. I hope you are all happy and healthy, doing the things you love with those that you love doing them with. Please do me a favor, smash the like button for me on the video if you enjoy the content. If you hit the subscribe button as well, I'll be very much grateful to you. Hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on today's topic, which is all about Everton and Nottingham Forest. We are turning our attentions to the bottom half of the table, the relegation zone, because of the news regarding Everton's confirmation of a reduction in the punishment, the points reduction that they got on Monday following the appeal of their first breach of FFP, profit and sustainability rules, from their breaches from a couple of years ago. That reduction in the deduction of points has likely consequences for Nottingham Forest and Everton again when they face the consequences of their second breach. That hearing is going to be heard next week on March the 7th and the 8th. And we've got some takes, some opinions from some leading names in the industry, either in the actual expertise of the space, in the likes of Kieran Maguire, or people like Gary Neville and the like, who are just very well heard and very well voiced mouthpieces for, I guess, ex-players in the game. Let's have a look. Before we do, guys, let's have a quick gander, shall we, at the Premier League table. And as I say, today's video is mainly about the bottom half, but I think it's really important and it's fascinating the way that the rules have been structured in terms of the consequences, like the breaches and the punishment that you'll face, then the appeals process, and then the last date for the appeal to be heard and the outcome of the appeal to be returned to the public. The date for that is actually 5 days after the end of the season. And so it's kind of crazy when you think of it that they couldn't squeeze that in 4 or 5 days earlier so that all the teams that might be affected by any particular points deduction removal or reduction will know the outcomes of whether they're staying in the Premier League or otherwise on the final day. As it stands, you might have a situation where both Nottingham Forest and Everton, if they are given, say, a 6 points deduction for their breaches, alleged breaches, then you may find that Luton or Burnley or Brentford or one of the other teams there may be safe at the end of the season on the final day. They may be in 17th or 16th spot. However, then after the appeal happens and takes place 5 days later, if there is a points reduction or a deduction or points deduction removal entirely, then you might find that Nottingham Forest and Everton have those points replaced onto the league table, and consequently, teams like Brentford or Everton or Luton may find, or Burnley or Sheffield United may find themselves back in the relegation zone. So, how on God's green earth can anyone really celebrate or commiserate their Premier League standing on the final day if we have to wait 5 further days for the final decision to be made and the final table to take place? It's silly and it's a ridiculous scenario, but let me get into the detail. Let's just look at the Premier League table for a second. At the moment, as it stands, Everton are 15th. This particular PremierLeague.com table does show that Everton's deducted 6 points following a breach of the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules. Before Monday, when the initial deduction was 10 points, guys, they would have only had 21 points, which would have seen them sat in 17th. We're only 1 point above Luton. So this news that happened on Monday, where on appeal, Everton's reduction or points deduction was reduced from 10 points to 6 points, has massive ramifications for the likes of Luton, who are doing everything they possibly can to scramble and clutch and claw with their fingernails every point possible to try to get them out. But then just to find Everton get the equivalent of an extra victory and an extra draw re-put onto their points tally, it must be a real hammer blow in their confidence and hopes. We will see what happens with the next appeal. Let's get into the news that summarize it. I do have 3 or 4 tabs open to go through, but I actually think this Nottinghamshire Live article I'm about to show you is probably a really good way of let's get it back. Here we go. Make it bigger. Of kind of explaining what is going on. So let's go. Nottinghamshire Live looks at the latest news around the Reds FFP charge, with Everton having already been slapped with a Premier League points deduction. The news surrounding Nottingham Forest has been dominated by financial fair play ever since they were charged in January over an alleged breach of the Premier League's profit and sustainability regulations. Forest and Everton have both been charged over financial breaches, with the Toffees being hit twice. The Merseysiders' first charge in November saw them deducted 10 points, which was reduced to 6 points on appeal earlier this week. And now both clubs await a decision which could drag on past the end of the current season. The outcome for both clubs may not be heard until May 24th, 5 days after the final day of the 23-24 Premier League campaign. Below is what has been said so far about Forest's charge. Let's start with Nuno Espirito Santo. He says, I understand you're going to ask a lot of things about this, but I can't tell you much. We still have to wait for the decision regarding us to be made. Then we will see. Absolutely. It cannot be a distraction. Our focus has to be on training, on the games, on preparation and our tasks. You should ask someone else from the club. My job is to prepare the team. So he's just saying nothing to do with me, or it is, but it's nothing I can inform you on. Let's just wait and see what happens. Kieran Maguire, probably the go-to guy alongside Stefan Borson or Swiss Ramble for financial fair play and the kind of financial side of business, something that we focus on a hell of a lot on this channel. So if you're interested in that stuff, then make sure you hit the subscribe button. He says that Forest have been given a raw deal over financial fair play. In his view, Forest have got a fairly raw deal in respect of financial fair play. They were promoted with a squad that cost 12 million up against £1 billion costing squads. They only have £61 million allowable loss for FFP purposes compared to 105 million for the established clubs of the Premier League. But having said that, it does look as though they've exceeded the limits. They were pretty close to them in the EFL. They signed an awful lot of players for big fees and others on smaller fees, but with big wages. So certainly when I did my sums, I called them out a couple of weeks before the announcement was made as being very high risk. It came as no surprise. It came as no surprise to a few of us that were doing those sort of calculations. But listen, at the end of the day, whilst the rules might be unnecessarily restrictive on teams coming up, obviously the rules are different. The 3-year reporting period for a Premier League club that has been in the Premier League for all 3 of those years allows for a £35 million loss per season, aggregated over 3. When you have been in the Championship, I believe the allowance goes down to 19.5. I could be wrong on that, but I think it's 19.5 rather than 35 million per season. And because Forest had been down for all 3 of those years in that year, then they were only allowed a loss of around £61 million. And so it's more difficult, but those rules are there to protect the teams in the likelihood that those teams that come up, predominantly most of them go back down again. And so they don't really want to allow clubs to spend, even though their ambitions might get ahead of themselves. In the case of Nottingham Forest, to a degree you could argue they have, that they are likely to go down. Now, Nottingham Forest didn't go down in their first season, but most teams do. And so with the benefit of having the balloon payments, or the parachute payments rather, when you do get relegated, if you stay within the laws, then you're unlikely to face the consequences of that yo-yo effect of going in and out of the Premier League Football Club. But look, the rules might not necessarily be there to support teams who are trying to compete against the very best. But if you look at a lot of the teams that have done it the right way over the years, teams like Bournemouth, teams like Brentford, teams like Brighton, when they've come up, they go about their process, their structure of their recruitment in terms of trying to raise up the level of their club. They do it through a different strategy that is more based on talent ID and youth team access and creating pathways through to the first team from feeder club relationships. And I think that is the best way, naturally, for most teams to be able to get through that early stage of when you first come up, trying to settle yourself into the Premier League. And then once you've got that foothold and things are starting to get more structurally steady, then you can, of course, then start to kind of push the boat out once you have the consistent revenue streams that are coming in. But Nottingham Forest went about it a different way, and they're, of course, facing the consequences of that. Simon Jordan says, when he commented around the situation around Forest and Everton in a recent column for the Daily Mail, he says the charges laid against Everton and Forest are not a crisis or a catastrophe, but simply a case of clubs who need to get their houses in order finally being brought into line. So he has less sympathy and more kind of apathy towards the excuses, more less interest. It's a case of the rules are the rules, sort yourselves out. He said clubs know or can forecast by January what salaries are going to be paid, what commercial revenues they generate, and what broadcast money they receive, so they can project their losses. It's true. Although to a degree, depending on where you are in Europe, you might not necessarily know if the revenues you're going to get are from campaign prize money in UEFA competitions are going to be as consistent as you may or may not believe. Teams that leave at competitions early or teams that go deeper may have more or less money to spend than they initially thought. Gary Neville's take on it is as such. He says that when it comes to Nottingham Forest, the Premier League will not do them for more than 6 points because there is a precedent. Neville told the Stick to Football podcast, sponsored by Sky Bet, if they give every team 6 points for breaking these rules, teams will know what they're going to get. And I think that there is an interesting take there for me. I think that there is, you do need to have precedent, although this is not necessarily the same. The application of laws here does not necessarily follow the same situation as it would in criminal law, where precedent is the way that it goes. And it depends on the circumstances, that the level of the breach, the frequency of the breach, how many breaches have been have taken place. In the case, if he's making the assumption or the assessment that because Everton broke one law, breached one time, and they got 6 points, then Nottingham Forest, if they are alleged to have breached the same rule one time, they should get 6 points as well. Then that's a reasonable take, as long as the breaches are within the same sort of contextual, reasonable spectrum. For me, if one team has broken by hundreds of millions in order to get some brilliant players in, that ultimately the 6 point deduction has been massively overwhelmed by the value of having those additional players that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to afford. And I don't necessarily think that's fair. But in the case of Everton and Nottingham Forest, the breaches were fairly minimal. And so the rule should be clear and reasonable judgment should be put into place. The first thing that needs to happen is they need to make it in. This is where I disagree with Gary Neville. The first thing that needs to happen is they need to make it in season. So the 3 years, £105 million, they need to make that, your losses need to be contained within one season. They need to do that. That will not, that will deal with a lot of these issues because you are not measuring it over a 3-year period. For me, I disagree with him on that regard. I think that the value of having the measuring period over 3 years is that if a team does outperform expectations meaningfully one season and they have just a rise, a meteoric rise where they maybe qualify for Europe, but ultimately that doesn't happen in the second year. So a team like maybe Newcastle, a team like maybe Brighton that we're seeing right now, where they outperformed in one season, then the additional value, the additional revenues that team has made in that particular season should be able to then be offset against the season before and the season after, or the 2 seasons after, in the case of the year later, that will allow them to kind of take advantage and stretch out the positives. If you are literally measuring on a year-by-year basis, then you won't really be able to make the decisions around the long term of your club and how you can realistically afford to pay for players if you are literally basing it on the revenues that are generated on a year-by-year basis. It simply doesn't make sense to me because the contract length of a player that you're signing is spread out over the length of the 4 or 5 years of the contract, whereas you might be making that decision to sign a player that is outside of your wheelhouse, above your level, above your pay grade, so to speak, if you have one particular year where you outperform and then you make the wrong assessment, the silly assessment that is your new level, your new normal, and that's not the case. So whilst I agree with Gary Neville to a degree that there should be precedents, as long as the punishments are of a similar level, a similar ilk, then the consistent punishment should be, if the breaches are of the same level, then the punishment should be. But in terms of making it over a 1 season period, for me on paper, I know it makes it seem like it's simpler, but I actually think it will result in more problems than it answers. Jamie Carragher's take is saying, what they're saying is we've already been punished for those 3 years and 2 of those charges are in there. So we can't get punished yet again for another 6 points when we've already been punished for those 2 years. I think Everton might get 1 or 2 points and Nottingham Forest will probably get 6. He also said, sorry, I've jumped ahead here, Everton's sanction is from last season, whereas Nottingham Forest situation is from this season. However, the problem with Everton is because it's a 3-year period, the new sanction includes 2 of the previous years. And again, I understand that might be an issue, but you have the ability, to Simon Jordan's point, of forecasting. And so if you have breached something because you meaningfully and significantly overspent in one particular season, then you're going to have to pull your, tighten the ropes and tighten your purse strings incredibly quickly for the second and third season. Otherwise, you might face that kind of overlap. And I think that these lessons, sometimes you need a catalyst for everybody else to sit up and take notice of the rules. I think it's reasonable, and I don't think you can keep changing the rules now. Now that the rules have been put in place and Everton have had to face the consequences of 2 years of different breaches and 2 different separate punishments, I don't think you can then now draw a line in the sand and change the rules again, because Everton will use that as a reason and a rationale for saying, hey, hang on a second, how come we are the guinea pig that always seems to get slapped up in these situations? I don't think that's fair at all. I think that we have to continue with it as it is for the largest perspective, largest point, for a little while at least, and see if everyone gets their houses in order. I'm with Simon Jordan mainly. Jamie Carragher's, I think, is talking from his kind of, maybe his base from the perspective there. But look, there's a bunch of different opinions, bunch of different rationales. What's your take on FFP? I personally think that Everton will get another 4 points, and I think Nottingham Forest will get 6. So I do think there'll be some consideration that Everton has already faced a points deduction. But for me, the craziest part of it all, guys, is that this particular outcome, we won't know. Again, let me come back to this Premier League table. If Nottingham Forest are faced with let's just use the example of a 6-point deduction for Forest and a 6-point deduction for Everton for these second breaches, then if both of those teams appeal that decision, you might find that Everton, currently with another 6-point deduction, would be beneath Luton Town, and Nottingham Forest would also be in the relegation zone. One of Everton or Nottingham Forest, as it stands, would be in the relegation zone and would be fighting that for their life. If one or both of those then had their points deduction reduced or removed entirely on the basis of an appeal that doesn't happen until 5 days after the season finishes, then how on God's green earth can Luton, can Burnley, can Brentford, can Nottingham Forest or Everton or anybody else celebrate their staying in the Premier League or commiserate and feel entirely sad about the fact that they probably are being relegated to the Championship if that all might change 5 days later? It is crazy. It is the equivalent of not being able to celebrate a goal because VAR hasn't drawn its lines yet. The whole thing is a nuts. Surely they can move that forward and have the appeal finished by the last weekend, before the last weekend's fixtures, so everybody knows where they stand and everybody knows what is going on. If they can't do that, it makes an entire mockery. And that, for me, is the first thing about the rules that need to be changed. Not the 3-year reporting period, not the money that you can or can't lose. None of the reasons why you can or can't lose money should be changed until they can at least change the day that everybody knows where they stand. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Like, subscribe, and comment. And as always, bye-bye.